The Vietnam War was one of America's most controversial wars. It was part of the larger Cold War. After World War II, communism began spreading around the world, and America intended to suppress its growth. James Boudreau was one of the 100,000 young men who enlisted for the Vietnam War.
It wasn't like in a conventional war where you take a hill or you take a piece of a landmark and you hold it. We would fight maybe sometimes for a day, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 30 seconds, and the next day we'd move on. So it wasn't about real estate. It was all about body count. It was a dirty war in that sense.
The communists were composed of the Northern Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. The anti-communist faction, on the other hand, was known as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, centered in the South. At the time, the domino theory was the driving force behind America's involvement in the Vietnam War. John F. Kennedy explained that if Vietnam fell to communism, then other countries would follow as well.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war.
President John F. Kennedy began sending U.S. troops into Vietnam in 1961. He had a plan to gradually reduce the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam. However, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, took over as commander-in-chief. Johnson had optimistic views about winning the war, and instead of pulling soldiers out, deployed thousands to Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin served as a catalyst for full U.S. involvement in Vietnam. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission in the Gulf when it was fired on by NVA Coastal Defense Forces. Again on August 4th, the NVA bombarded the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy with torpedoes. At this point, Johnson had the full support of Congress to enter Vietnam. Because of the direct attacks and Kennedy's death, the war escalated dramatically. Johnson increased the mere 16,000 troops deployed in Vietnam to over 500,000 in order to combat the Tet Offensive. This was an operation by the NVA to attack the 7 largest cities of South Vietnam in order to make a popular uprising that would eventually overthrow the Southern Vietnamese government and end the war. At the height of the war, James Boudreau was deployed to Vietnam alongside thousands of other soldiers to attempt to regain control. James Boudreau grew up in the small fishing village of Wedgeport, Nova Scotia. Even though he lived in Canada, he was paying attention to America's involvement in the war. Eventually, James moved to Reading, Massachusetts to live with family until he was 19. As soon as he became an American citizen, James voluntarily decided to enlist for the Marines because the draft would have forced him to join anyways. James was motivated to join the Marines for personal reasons, not for the fear of communism. The Marine Corps had a dignant reputation of turning the enlisted into tough soldiers and provided a test of manhood. Many Americans James grew up with were being sent to Vietnam, so he wanted to join them. James spent 6 weeks of basic training at Parris Island in South Carolina, and spent another 6 weeks in North Carolina for infantry training, until he was sent to Vietnam.
The orders, it was 25 Marines. It didn't specifically mention my name. And so at that time I was working in the office at the Force Reconnaissance Company while doing the training. So I remember that the sergeant that was there, he said, you don't have to go. But all my friends were going. I mean, for sure they were going. He said, I could just keep you off the list. I said, no. I said, I want to go.
He left for Vietnam in July 1969. All 25 Marines, including James, were sent to Da Nang, South Vietnam.
We got off the plane and said, God, this is hot. It's hot and humid. I mean, you have to think I got there on I think it was the 10th of July, or 11th, maybe 10th or 11th of July. So it was the middle of the summer, and when you got off the plane, I mean, you're in full uniform, and it was hot.
James's squad was part of the Bravo Company. When his squad was stationary, they were either on ambush, perimeter duty, or a day patrol. Every day, James was doing one of these tasks.
Because to survive was, if you were the point man, was to drop to the ground and shoot, so that everybody else behind you was shooting over your head, not, shooting you in the back, sort of thing. So, and those friendly fire accidents were more normal than people might anticipate. See, the platoon lieutenant said, "Boudreau, you're walking points." I said, "Okay, you know, you obey orders, right?" So this one time, it's, maybe I'd been there in the bush maybe 3 weeks, and we were walking on these old railroad track, and in the distance, which was maybe 100 yards in front of me, maybe closer, but around 100 yards, I saw 2 enemy men crossing the track. And I mean, we're talking, it's about maybe 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. So right away, I open up with my rifle, and I'm standing. Of course, you know what happens, right? Is that the bullets were zinging left and right over on either side of my head. But it really scared me, really. Much more, the people behind me were scaring me, much more than the 2 enemy soldiers in front.
Combat against the NVA was similar to a traditional war. However, the Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, which meant that the soldiers had to be ready for anything, and had to be cautious of enemy traps. Soldiers found it was difficult to differentiate between the Viet Cong and civilians.
Atmosphere was very tense all the time because people were shooting at you, and you had to be very, very careful with, I think today they call them IUDs, but we called them booby traps in those days. So if you were walking, you could be tripping a wire, you could be stepping into on a tripwire and get yourself blown up. The way we distinguish between the Viet Cong and the civilians is usually the Viet Cong usually wore black pajamas, but not always. They could have been wearing, the villagers' pants, which could have been black with a white top or a green top, and there's those little, those bamboo hats that you've seen, conical bamboo hats. Mm-hmm. So they could just as well have been wearing those. And we had very little direct contact with the Viet Cong.
James returned to Boston in 1970 and finished his education at Newton Community College. He now lives in Calgary, Canada, where he works in pharmaceuticals. The U.S. presence in the war conflicted with many Americans, specifically young students, those affected by the draft, and the hippie generation. Student activism against the war argued that America's intervention in Vietnam was unjustified, and that the threat of communism was hiding America's imperialistic views. Television brought the images of war to the kitchen table, and with no clear signs of victory in Vietnam, helped to stimulate the opposition of the war in Americas. The effects of the war were immediately felt in the United States. It divided the American public over the issues of the humiliating withdrawal, the draft, the division in society created by an anti-war movement, and most importantly, a sense of distrust in the government. This loss of trust was a result of Americans believing that the government had not anticipated the difficulties of the war, while young citizens died in unprecedented numbers. 58,000 American soldiers died in the Vietnam War, and yet America fell far short of its goal.
Our country learned a valuable lesson in Vietnam, and that was you just can't push a people to do something that they're not ready to do. The draft was probably the worst thing they could ever have done, was instituting the draft. And I think you have to look at it also in the context of what was happening in that time frame. It was a real liberation period, with women's liberation, with freedom, with the drug culture. All of that was converging with the Vietnam War going on. And it was the first war that was televised. So every night, everybody would sit, and watch Walter Cronkite and what was going on in Vietnam. And it wasn't going. We were losing, more and more Americans were being killed. But they kept saying, well, yeah, but we killed double the Vietnamese or NVA than the Americans did. But we weren't making any progress. So it was a real tough time for the country, but we learned our lesson.
Senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't one stand in the doorway, don't lock up their heart, or he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled.